Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. We are continuing learning more about Rome and the ancient time BC. This is going to be dealing with Hannibal, the Second Punic War. We did some videos on Oversimplified to kind of like get an idea of what the Second Punic War was like. But HistoryMarche is going to go a little bit more in detail, I believe. Glad you're here. Hit that like button. We love you. Jump into it.
As a fan of our channel, you should definitely check out our friends over at CuriosityStream, my personal favorite streaming service that features thousands of documentaries geared towards the lifelong quest to learn, explore, and understand. I've been subscribed to CuriosityStream for over 2 years now. After General Hasdrubal the Fair was assassinated by a Celtic slave, 26-year-old Hannibal was elected as the new Carthaginian commander.
So we're going to start here. Obviously, the First Punic War went down, and Hasdrubal was actually the father of Hannibal, and he was a very successful general while fighting on Sicily, I believe, as well, defending Carthage in time of need. Basically, some time has passed. They took Hannibal, of course, into Iberia at about 9 years old, and he had not seen Carthage, and he will not see Carthage till he makes an entire roundabout back towards the end of the war. So this entire documentary is probably just gonna, maybe, I don't know when it ends. It's parts 1 through 5, but yeah, this is where we pick up from 9 to 26. He's here with his dad in Iberia, as I believe Iberia is full of silver, and silver is basically recharging the Carthaginian Empire because they're having to pay a huge reparations due to the First Punic War. It's similar parallel to like the Reichstag in the First World War. So let's see what happens. Let's see what happens.
The young general immediately made plans to invade Rome, but he couldn't begin the campaign before strengthening Carthage's control over the Iberian Peninsula. So Hannibal went to work. He launched 2 highly successful campaigns in 221 and 220 BC, extending Carthaginian influence beyond the Targus River. But while on the return route to New Carthage, Hannibal was taken by surprise by a coalition of Iberian tribes. Led by the Carpetani tribe, the Iberians assembled a large army. They blocked Hannibal's path and fortified their position against the Targus River, then waited for the Carthaginian general to attack. Here, Hannibal showed his military genius for the first time. Instead of attacking the Iberians head-on, he erected his own fortified camp and waited. By day's end, his scouts found a river crossing to the southeast. During the wee hours of the night, Hannibal ordered a small contingent to stay in the camp and keep all campfires burning, creating the illusion that the whole Carthaginian army was still encamped.
That's even smart, because we've seen in war that they'd leave fires and then they would burn and then they'd all exit and not leave anyone behind. This ensured that there was no way that any possible tribes could scout them out.
Meanwhile, he led his army on a swift flanking maneuver further up the river. By sunrise the next day, Hannibal was behind the Iberian position, feigning retreat towards New Carthage. Thinking that the Carthaginians were retreating, the Iberians rushed to intercept them. But once they were midstream, Hannibal sprung his trap and unleashed his cavalry. Iberian infantrymen, chest deep in the fast-flowing river, couldn't offer much resistance and were cut down with ease by the Carthaginian cavalry charge.
That is genius.
Those who managed to cross were trampled by the elephants.
And by the way, these elephants, think about these elephants. They're native to, really they're more native to sub-Saharan Africa more than Saharan Africa, which is where Carthage is. And they have just traversed the world after Hannibal.
By now, the Iberian army lost all cohesion, and the mass of tribal warriors started fleeing. Hannibal ordered his army to pursue them across the river, completely routing the enemy.
Dang.
On the Targus River, Hannibal had his first major victory, but Rome took notice. Wanting to stop Hannibal's expansion, the Romans made their presence felt. Already allied with the wealthy and powerful city of Saguntum, Rome declared it their protectorate, an act that Hannibal perceived as a violation of the treaty signed by the two great powers in 225 BC.
And yeah, Saguntum's going to become like an enclave in this Iberian Peninsula. As I'm not sure what river is right below the Pyrenees Mountains, but the one right below Tarraco, that river is going to be like the de facto border of Carthage to Rome influence. But Saguntum's going to be just like this little bubble, and that's going to be where things really start to kick off.
Sea, which divided the Iberian Peninsula along the Ebro River into Carthaginian and Roman spheres of influence. A sworn enemy of Rome, it didn't take long before Hannibal acted. He marched on Saguntum and besieged the city.
So, trying to understand this, it looks like it's almost like a castle up on the hill, and then there's city below.
In 219 BC, the Carthaginian army reached the outskirts of Saguntum. The city was heavily fortified, situated atop steep slopes and cliffs, high above the surrounding plain. Saguntines requested aid from Rome, but the Romans were busy fighting the Illyrians. Nevertheless, with provisions stockpiled, Saguntum was prepared. Besieging it would not be easy. Hannibal installed a blockade around the entire city and placed most of his forces at the western end. Saguntines stubbornly kept pushing every Carthaginian assault back, but the siege went on for months, and the many assaults gradually wore down portions of the wall. Eventually, the defenders had to abandon their outer defenses and form up behind the inner wall. Slowly and relentlessly, Hannibal's army made progress. And after 8 brutal months, the Saguntines made their last stand at the citadel.
Oh, it is a citadel.
Soon after, the city fell. Inhabitants that survived the siege were either killed or sold into slavery.
And that's usually what happens, of course.
After the fall of Saguntum, Rome demanded justice for what they perceived was the violation of the treaty, and, claiming that Saguntum was in the Roman sphere of influence according to the treaty, they asked Carthage to hand over Hannibal to Rome so he can be punished. But the Carthaginian Senate stood by their general, and by the end of the year, the Second Punic War began.
Here we go. Good intro. HistoryMarche.
Hannibal wintered in New Carthage, preparing for the upcoming campaign. He placed his brother Hasdrubal in charge of Iberia, with 15,000 troops and 21 elephants, along with a fleet of ships to protect the coastline. To break possible tribal allegiances, around 15,000 Iberian infantry were swapped for 15,000 African infantry, who were more reliable, sending the Iberians to Carthage and Libya to bolster defenses against a possible Roman landing. And in the spring of 218 BC, with the full support from the Senate, Hannibal marched out of New Carthage with 54,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry, dividing his army into 3 columns. But beyond the Ebro, tribes allied to Rome were hostile to the Carthaginians, and it took Hannibal about 2 months to pacify the region. He placed around 10,000 troops under the command of Hanno, ordering him to establish a line of defense on the Ebro against possible incursions into Carthaginian territory. With 38,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants left at his disposal, Hannibal...
So now the territory isn't expanding, but he's moving. Now, I think he's going to try to cross the Alps, and he's going to go through this Celtic territory, and these Celtic people not like people like Hannibal, and they're going to attack him initially.
Crossed the mountains and encamped on the other side of the Pyrenees. Meanwhile, the Romans divided their forces. Their plan was to send consul Publius Cornelius Scipio to intercept Hannibal in Iberia. Simultaneously, Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus sailed to Sicily, with the intent of attacking Carthage itself if Scipio managed to stop Hannibal's advance. Additional Roman forces were left to guard the recently conquered Gallic lands in the Po Valley, a region the Romans called Cisalpine Gaul. Back at the foot of the Pyrenees Mountains, Hannibal laid the groundwork for the invasion. Rather than fighting his way towards Rome, he did everything to avoid conflict with the Gallic tribes, mostly paying them for free passage through their territory, promising that his only interest is to fight Rome. Moreover, Carthaginian messengers returning from the Po Valley assured Hannibal that the Gallic tribes there would welcome him, and that they had already begun hostilities against Rome in anticipation of his arrival.
Wow.
This was welcome news for Hannibal, because he knew the Po Valley could provide more manpower and act as a staging point for operations into Roman territory.
Yeah, because you really don't have many, you can't really refill at this point. You're very far away from Carthage. I mean, the best you can do is the people left in Iberia, but you're going to have to refuel because you're going to fight a ton of Romans once you get to Italia.
As Hannibal approached the river Rhone, Scipio's army disembarked at Massalia to resupply, while on their way to Iberia. The Roman general knew that Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees, but he wrongly estimated that the Carthaginian general was still far from the Rhone. In truth, Hannibal's army was only 4 days' march away from Massalia. Hannibal rested his army for 3 days in hostile territory and began preparations to cross the Rhone. With the Roman army just 4 days away, Hannibal wanted to avoid a set-piece battle with the Gauls, eager to press on towards the Italian peninsula as soon as possible. But on the opposite riverbank, encamped was the army of the Cavaras tribe, a Roman ally.
Uh-oh.
They gathered all their boats and built a barrier on the riverbank in preparation to contest the Carthaginian crossing. But Hannibal devised a cunning plan.
Again.
On the third night, under the cover of darkness, he sent a flanking detachment under the command of Hanno, son of Bomilcar, some 40 kilometers, 25 miles north.
25 miles north. Think about that. That is a marathon. They ran a marathon, and that's one way. So if they go 25 miles, then they go 25 miles, that's 50 miles. That's determination.
Hanno crossed the river and rested his troops for 1 day. On the second night after leaving the Carthaginian camp, Hanno's detachment again moved during the night, eventually deploying behind the Cavaras camp at dawn. The trap was set. Early next morning, Hanno used smoke to signal Hannibal to start crossing the Rhone. As the Carthaginian vessels were lowered into the massive river, Cavaras' army formed a line on the opposite riverbank. Hannibal was one of the first to cross, to the roars and cheers from his men on the western bank. As the Carthaginians started disembarking on the eastern riverbank, Hanno sent a part of his force to loot and destroy the Cavaras' camp, while he personally led the charge against the Gauls near the river. The Cavaras were stunned by the flanking maneuver, and they began fleeing the field in panic, unable to cope with Hannibal's perfectly synchronized attacks.
Yeah, like this obviously isn't to overwhelm the opponent and beat them, but to overwhelm them and confuse them as they flee. And I imagine they turn around, they see hundreds of horsemen coming at them, and then they see the smoke and fire burning where they slept the night before. That's got to be disconcerting. They're gonna leave immediately.
With the Gauls scattered, the battle was soon over, and the Carthaginians hastily proceeded to cross the river. Most of Hannibal's troops crossed the Rhone by the end of the day, while it took another day to get the elephants across the river. While the Carthaginian army gathered on the eastern bank, friendly Gallic messengers from the tribes in the Po Valley arrived, warning Hannibal that a Roman fleet is anchored nearby. Hannibal sent his scouts to locate Scipio's army, and, incredibly, not long after, his Numidian scouts stumbled into a Roman Gallic scouting party. Both generals now knew of each other's whereabouts. Scipio quickly moved north to confront Hannibal, but by the time the Romans reached the crossing point a few days later, only an empty Carthaginian camp was left behind. Hannibal had no time to waste. He had to reach the Alps before the winter. But trouble was brewing in Iberia. Scipio placed his brother, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, in charge of leading the army into Iberia, while he headed back to the Po Valley to assume command of Roman troops there and prepare for the Carthaginian invasion. Scipio Calvus, now in charge of the invasion force, disembarked at Emporiae. The Greek trading cities and the Iberian tribes in the region welcomed the Romans. But even prior to the arrival of Roman troops, the Carthaginians began to lose control over the conquered region, as Hanno's force wasn't large enough to conduct offensive operations. What's worse, Hanno only learned about the Roman arrival when Scipio Calvus was well on his way towards the Ebro River. He sent word to Hasdrubal, who began marching north with 8,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. But instead of waiting for Hasdrubal, Hanno marched out with 10,000 troops to meet the 20,000-strong Roman army. Scipio Calvus easily crushed the Carthaginians, killing 6,000 and capturing 2,000 troops, along with Hanno himself. Once Hasdrubal arrived, he didn't have enough troops to meet the Romans in battle, so he launched fast-moving raids along the coast. Carthaginian raiders killed many Roman sailors as they were foraging, reducing the effectiveness of the Roman fleet by half. Nevertheless, Rome now had full control over Iberia, north of the Ebro River, a serious blow to the Carthaginian war effort. Moreover, northern Iberia would become a base of operations for Roman incursions into Carthaginian territory south of the Ebro River. Meanwhile,
That's insane right there. And I think that's where we're going to stop today, guys. Really, we just began with the beginnings of Hannibal in Iberia on his way to the Alps, and his first couple main incursions with the enemy being tribes, and the tribes being outsmarted by Hannibal's military wit. And now he's going to have to face the entire Roman army, the entire Roman Empire. Essentially, feels like by himself, because Carthage is way far away. The only thing he can hope for is allying with Cisalpine Gallic tribes that may have resentment towards the occupating Romans on the other side of the Alps. So that's what we'll talk about next time. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time, peace out. Bye-bye.